Hi, welcome to Digging for Truth, presented by Associates for Biblical Research. I'm your host, Henry Smith. We're often told that the book of Genesis is largely, if not entirely, mythical. History, archaeology, and science supposedly contradict many of the events that are described in the early chapters 1 through 11. Today, scientist Dr. Brian Thomas joins us as we engage with some of these claims while we explore his new book, Living in the Light of Genesis. Dr. Thomas, welcome back to Digging for Truth. Good to have you on the show again, my friend.
Well, thank you for having me again.
All right. Well, we're glad you're on. We're going to be exploring your book today, Living in Light of Genesis. Very excited to talk about it. Great read. I really appreciate you send me a copy, my friend. I enjoyed it. So let's start about the book. Why did you write this book? A lot of books out there about Genesis, right? And what were some of the main reasons or the main impetus behind doing this?
Well, I guess I could say the main reason for me to write this is the same main reason why I work for the Institute for Creation Research. And I think it ties into the main reason why the Institute exists in today's world. And that is to showcase the science that really does support Genesis. And the reason that's such a big deal is because we have so many people, and some of our scientists, myself included, who spent years of our lives doubting God's word and doubting that did he really mean what he said in Genesis? And then if I can't trust what he meant over here, can I trust what he meant over there and the other parts of the Bible? And it's like, which parts do I trust? And can I even trust him if this is his word? And he's, so we had all these years spent like in doubt. And then we had this creation conversion. And I basically tell the story of my creation conversion, sort of the long version throughout the book, so that I want to take the reader on a journey with me where we go from looking at this objection, answering it, looking at that objection, answering that. And I went through that. It took me like 5 years. And at the end of that long road, I ended up, believing the Bible, believing Genesis. And it made such a difference because now I can trust God's word fully, and I can trust the God of the word fully.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, that's what struck me, the way you structured the book. And it's really an easy read. You and I are going to focus more on the scientific stuff in our time together today, but I do want to encourage people. You touch on your story, you touch on Genesis, its essential nature for doctrine, and the effect on the rejection of Genesis on culture. So you do a really nice job of weaving all that together in a rather small book. It's not a giant book, so it's an easy read. I want to encourage people to pick it up. But I do want to shift a little into the scientific area. Let's talk about science broadly, Brian, because I think people misunderstand. Here, I'll share an anecdote with you. I had a recent experience. Somebody said, I have a neighbor, I was talking to them about Jesus and the resurrection, and they said, prove that to me scientifically. And I thought to myself, well, would you do that if you were asking the question, does my wife love me? Or did Julius Caesar exist? Right? Those kind of things. And in your book, you deal with the limits of science. So build off, take that anecdote I just gave and how you talk about that kind of thing in the book.
Yeah, boy, there's so many anecdotes like that. A salesperson just came to my house 2 days ago, and I didn't buy the stuff he was selling, but in the process, he said, what do you do for a living? I said, I'm a scientist and I research dinosaur proteins, because I do. And he said, well, that's interesting. Do you do that? He asked, to find out sort of how old they were. I was like, science can't do that. He goes, what?
Yeah.
So it's like new to, and it's even new to scientists. Like I go to science conventions and I present posters at secular science meetings, and I interact with secular scientists, and they just take it for granted that science, some sort of scientists over there can actually determine the age of this, that, or the other. It's not possible. I mean, it's what are we measuring? Agicles? That we can't, so we can measure isotope ratios, but we have to convert those ratios into a time estimate by plugging those ratios into a formula And the formula always has variables that are unknown and unknowable. So it's just not the right science. Historical science, you can put clues together to construct a history, like we do in the court of law, forensic sciences. So if we define science, if you apply forensics analysis to historical events like the resurrection, then you'll end up, as others have already done, determining and deciding, Jesus really did rise from the dead. And that's similar to what we've done in my book, Living in Light of Genesis, is applying forensic analyses to the historicity or lack thereof of Genesis. And I kept finding test after test that Genesis stands tall and should be understood plainly as written. So science is limited, and we are soaked in a culture that believes science can do way more than it actually can.
Yeah, and we probably should, as the church, learn from the lessons of the recent past 4 or 5 years about science, and how ideas and ideology and politics can affect it, and how worldview affects what is done with science. We can't get into all that, but that's something for us to be thinking about. Let's mention a couple things here, Brian, about you mentioned dating. One of the anecdotes you give in there, or not anecdotes, evidences, has to do with comets. Tell us, give us a tutorial on comets and how they sort of point to a different conclusion as far as age goes.
Well, the mantra that gets repeated, and it's there to be taught, so we teach it, and I learned it and memorized it because that's how it works, is that the Earth, formed 4.5 billion years ago from a swirling cloud of gas and dust, according to the nebular hypothesis, and so did comets. So they're 4.5 billion years old. Memorize it, believe it, boom. And then you actually look at these comets. They're dirty ice balls flying through space, and there's all kinds. There's hundreds, thousands of them, I guess, and but they die, so to speak, especially as they come closer to the sun. So a lot of these comets have they swing very close to the sun at part of their orbit, and then they swing far away from the sun on their orbital trajectories. Anyway, when they come close to the sun, they get so close that the sun burns off and melts. Well, it doesn't melt, but it sublimates, I think, the ice, and these things are gone. And so we have short period comets that at today's erosion, so to speak, destruction rates, they could only last 10,000 or so years. And yet there's plenty of them in the night sky. Where are they coming from? If they're billions of years old, how is it that there's so many so close and orbiting the sun so often? They pose a real challenge to the mantra that we're all told about billions of years for these comets. They look like they're only thousands of years old.
Very good, very good. It's a good summary. Again, we encourage people to pick up a copy of Brian's book, Living in Light of Genesis, and we'll be right back after this break. ABR is excited to announce the publication of Volume 2 from our excavations at Khirbet el-Maqader. The volume details archaeological remains from about 350 BC to the 8th century. This includes a New Testament village that may have been visited by Jesus. Over 400 pages of analysis, photos, and maps. You can pick up a copy today by visiting BibleArchaeology.org. Hi, this is Digging for Truth. Welcome back. I'm here with Dr. Brian Thomas, and we're talking about his book, Living in Light of Genesis. Now today, Brian, we're focusing on some of the scientific discussion that you have in your book. Integrates very nicely with the bigger picture of what you're trying to accomplish in it. We were talking about comets in our last segment, how it looks like, it's hard to explain those in a long time frame. Another item that's very interesting, I've heard this before, you mentioned in your book, which I find fascinating, is what you call the galaxy wind-up problem. Tell us about that, what it is, and what's the problem, and how you think it fits better into our understanding of the Genesis account.
Yeah, well, it's not a problem for those of us who have gone ahead and decided to take Genesis straightforwardly and the history therein straightforwardly, as Jesus did, by the way, when he quoted from Genesis chapters 1 and 2, as though they were conveying actual history. And according to those scriptures, God made the heavens and the earth, only 6,000 or so years ago, and he did it in the span of 6 days. And so that's crazy talk, for most of my colleagues and many of my friends and family members, of course. And it was crazy talk to me. But when I ran into these arguments, I thought, well, maybe there's more to believing the history in Genesis than in other words, maybe when I believe Genesis, I don't have to take a step of faith into the dark, but rather when I learned about these evidences like the galaxy windup problem, I'm taking a step of faith into the light of the truth, and it's actually a sensible way to go. So anyway, it's not a problem for my worldview anymore. The galaxy windup problem, which basically says that with spiral galaxies, those are the pretty ones with the spiral arms. The center of the galaxy actually winds faster than the outer arms. So eventually, they should wind up merging into one another, so that the arms just turns into a spiral disk or something like that. So that's a problem, and crazy, in my opinion, hypotheses have been spun out there to deal with the problem, but it's they invoked density waves, but then you have the problem of where does that come from? Something to keep the stars staying in these arms over their supposed billions of years of assumed history. But the thing is, these spiral galaxies, are really, really far out in space, and so that's an additional problem, because in the secular models, the farthest galaxies should be the oldest, so they should really have wound up completely upon themselves, and they have not yet done so. They look young, relatively speaking. Anyway, if God created them in that state, then we have no problem. They're just beautiful spiral galaxies that he made.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating thing. They are so far away. I mean, billions and billions of light years away. It's really quite extraordinary as far as distance goes. Let's talk a little bit about something you mentioned in the book as well. I'm going to shift in the direction a little bit. Something people have heard before. Most people have heard this. I've heard this. It has to do with DNA, and it has to do with a comparison of human beings and chimps. Tell us about what the conventional thing that's floating around out there is, and a little bit more about what's more of the reality.
Wow, you sure know how to go from macro to micro.
I did, but DNA. There we go. Well, God created it all, so we can jump around like that.
Well, that's what I do in my book, so we might as well.
Yeah, amen.
Thank you for that. Well, I was at the a Dallas area museum here several years ago, and there was a display that basically you push a button to get to determine your right answer, and the question was something like, do humans and chimps share 99% the same DNA, 90%, or 70%? And if you mash the 70, it had a big red X, and it went meh. If you mash the 90, meh. And only if you mash the 99 button would it give you a bright a green light and a smiley ding. Correct? That's actually what scientifically, that's just fake news. It's become like a meme or something in our society that we're 99% genetically identical. That's not even possible. I mean, just consider and I think I do this in my book, the raw sizes of the chimp versus the human genomes. So human genome is how big? 3 billion bases, chimp 3.2 billion. So the 0.2, that's 200 million additional base pairs in their DNA, which would make the maximum similarity to be 96% or so similar. And that's just on raw size. But then if you compare the differences, if you compare the sequences, which only a handful of workers have done objectively, that you end up with something on the order of 74% genetically similar maximum. So this 99% that's just not correct, but they have to have it because in their worldview, modern chimps descended supposedly from modern humans, and you can't add hundreds of thousands of new coding instructions in just those 6 million years. You don't have enough population and enough time for enough creatures to die, because it's all about the death of the unfit. Anyway, once we pull in the good science, where we do base for base or chunk for chunk anyway, comparison on the sequences, it's only 74% similar. Well, that's pretty similar, but that makes sense because, we both breathe air. Chimps and humans both eat bananas, and we both make milk. We both make hair. So there should be lots of similarities, and therefore there are. But there's also a lot of differences that very few evolutionary colleagues of mine even want to recognize or think about or talk about. And we're here to say, look, the differences are huge. As similar as we may be in some respects, we have different DNA sequences, and definitely that's masquerading as science, but it's science falsely so called. This silly 99% business.
Yeah, I thought that was very helpful in the book. It made me think of, if you had two computer programs that were 74% similar, you're obviously going to have commonalities in programming, and as you mentioned, chimps live in the same world that we do. They have legs, they have arms, they have fingers, so there's going to be that, but the differences were so stark. And when you start to drill down, I think the lesson from that too for churchgoers who are not scientists is just to simply stop for a moment and think critically about the claim. And that's what I appreciate about what you do, Brian. Well, we're going to take a break, and right after that, we'll be back with our final segment.
Bible and Spade is a non-technical quarterly publication published by the Associates for Biblical Research. Written from a scholarly and conservative viewpoint, Bible and Spade supports the inerrancy of the biblical record and is a must-read for both the serious Bible student and anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible. Archaeological evidence, properly interpreted, upholding the history of the Bible. Subscribe today at BibleArchaeology.org.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm your host, Henry Smith. I'm here with Dr. Brian Thomas, scientist, talking about his book, Living in Light of Genesis. We want to encourage you to pick up a copy of that. It's a great read, few hours, you'll learn a lot. Today with Dr. Thomas, we're just focusing on some scientific questions. Brian, I wanted to talk a little bit about, you talk about this discovery called Homo naledi. Now, we've had guests on before talking about the anatomical features of Homo naledi, discovered in a cave in South Africa. There's questions over whether or not it was human or not. But I want to focus on the dating of Homo naledi. In your book, you mentioned that it's been dated with maybe about 6 different methods. So tell us a little bit about that and some of the results.
Sure. Well, one way to date Homo naledi is with offer it flowers, and another way is to offer it candies. And so not that dating? Is that not what? Okay.
No, it's not Valentine's. It's not Valentine's Day. We want to find out how old this guy is.
Age dating, not romantical dating. Okay.
All right.
Yeah. So the big, when it was first publicized, the big hope was that this would be the missing link, right? And so they needed to fall within their expected timeline. It's got to be at least 3 million years old. And so they found that in all these different methods, and I had to print them out because there's so many. So I'm looking at my cheat sheet here, but they did actually they had direct age estimates from carbon-14 of the actual bones. They used ESR on the teeth, 2 teeth samples, and then they used uranium thorium dating on the teeth also. Then they used something called OSL CAM on a flow stone that was above it, and then there's another flow stone below the fossil layers. So they used all these different techniques. Okay, here's the spread, and here's the news story. When I wrote this news for ICR.org, I thought, this is such a spread. This is crazy. So the OSL on the flowstone was 560. This is OSL CAM, 560,000, but the uranium thorium 290,000. The other flowstone 353,000, but the OSL, the other OSL was 849,000, and then the tooth ESR, electron spin resonance, I think, is 95,000. But then uranium thorium on the same tooth, 45,000. I mean, these aren't even in the same ballpark. These are supposed to be years, but none of them fit. None of them match one another. And I just, okay, so then there's more, but the carbon-14 dates of the actual bones, that came around roughly 34,000. Carbon years, you know, we have uranium years, we have OSL years, ESR years. Will the real years please stand up?
Yes.
How do you sort through all this?
Yeah.
And so what the authors determined, they just picked something out of the air and they said, well, we think these fossils were deposited 236 to 335,000 years ago. And they said, well, the reason that the carbon ages are so much younger is because, and then enter excuse. But they didn't test or measure evidence for or against the excuse that they offered for the carbon-14. I don't think any of these ages are actual ages, and I think this is yet another example for us, and we find it all throughout the literature for decades. We at ICR have been researching this, and this is typical to have discordant ages, different techniques on the same rock, on the same fossil, and they give different ages, or even the same technique and it gives different ages. I don't think the ages, you know, what it gives you is an array of numbers that you could cherry pick from. That's all it gives you.
Yeah, you did a good job explaining that in the book. And you and I had a previous episode together talking about carbon-14 dating. We encourage people to watch that to understand that further, and how that actually shows that a lot of stuff that's supposed to be long ages is actually much younger than those dates. All right, Brian. Well, let's just talk about a summary of the book here, because your main argument here, your main truth that you want to put forth is that, you know, the book of Genesis is actually a foundation for real science, especially when it comes to the origin question. Let's wrap up our show, spend a couple minutes telling the audience the importance and why you believe that's true.
Well, it's not just a foundation for science, which it is. Why do good science if there's no good reason or end to it, other than personal gain? Maybe some might, but anyway, we do good science because Genesis is true, because we actually live in an actual history, a timeline, and Genesis starts with in the beginning. Well, that's the beginning of time, and if we say Genesis is a joke, then maybe we live in a cyclical, forever universe, and we're not going anywhere in the end. So why even do science? So Genesis gives us a motivation to want to do science. It also tells us the origin of sin, and that we have a fallen, wrecked world that's a result of our sin. So a lot of why we do science is to mitigate some of those effects of the fall. So we want to do good health science so that we don't have to suffer as much. We want to do good food and agricultural science so that we don't have to labor as hard and sweat as the curse was pronounced on Adam. But anyway, there's more than that. So when I came back to believing in Genesis, it affected every area. One example, I used to believe that marriage was silly because I heard the meme that's false, but that half of marriages fail. And I was like, I don't want to get involved in that. Well, when I learned that Genesis teaches in chapter 2 that God invented marriage, I realized, marriages don't fail because it's a bad institution in and of itself. God's not to blame, but because we are sinners and we do a bad job at what he has set up. But then my view of marriage went up. I was like, marriage is to be respected. And I mean, within months, I met the lady. And now we've been married for 29 years. Amen. And we're now happy to have our first grandbaby. All that came from my renewed relationship with God himself, who revealed to me the truth about where I came from. And he proved himself to be totally trustworthy.
Well, amen to that, Brian. Thank you for sharing that. That's a great story, and I'm sure it'll encourage our audience. Thank you for the work you do. Thank you for being a friend of the ABR ministry and being our guest again, and we'll see you again next time.
Thank you very much.
All right, friends, thank you for joining us for Digging for Truth. Please pick up a copy of Dr. Thomas's book, and we hope you were encouraged by this program today. We appreciate your support, and we'll see you again soon.